Welcome to Legacy Builders, strategies for building successful family enterprises. Brought to you by Beacon Family Office at Asante Financial Management Limited. I'm your host, Corey Gagnon, Senior Wealth Advisor. And on this show, we explore global ideas, concepts, and models that help family enterprises better navigate the complexities of family wealth. Today, we kick off our first episode of 2024 by welcoming Gerry Meyer, founder and CEO of Meyer Advisory Group. With over 36 years as an HR practitioner, consultant, and advisor, Gerry brings his knowledge in organizational effectiveness to our show. His leadership spans public and private sectors, family enterprises, nonprofits, real estate, high tech, and professional services industries. Holding the CPHR and FBA designation, Gerry is a seasoned professional equipped to navigate diverse business challenges, making him a trusted ally for those seeking transformative insights in human resources and family enterprise advisory. My goal is to be the most curious person in today's conversation with Gerry Meyer, where we discuss expectations of the active and next generations, emphasizing the significance of aligning these expectations for a successful family succession. We'll explore stories surrounding development plans and necessary timelines for cultivating executive skill set. Additionally, we'll unravel the vital components of nurturing human capital and constructing a forward-thinking enterprise plan. Gerry, drawing from his wisdom, asserts that he considers himself and non-family executives not doing their job effectively unless they're just one comment away from being fired. Now, let's dive in. Welcome, Gerry. We're excited to have you here today to share your wealth of knowledge and experiences with us. Let's dive in, shall we?
We certainly shall. Thank you for the opportunity to chat.
Gerry, imagine you're delivering a commencement speech to the graduating class of 2024, and you have the chance to inspire them with your story. How would you begin your speech to convey the incredible lessons and expertise that you've gained along your career?
That's a really interesting question to kind of kick off the conversation, because I certainly recognize that my career path has been rather unique and opportunistic. And I started out wanting to be an architect. Unfortunately, was not accepted to any of the schools, then went into general BA program, ultimately ended up in the field of human resources and was in that field for many years, and culminating in being the VP of HR for a family-owned and operated business. And I was there for about 12 years. So part of my answer is plan where you want to go, think about what your career might take a look at, but do allow for the opportunities to arise that may not necessarily fit within that plan. For example, when I left the family business and moved to Vancouver, I fully expected to get another VP of HR role. And as it turned out, I was not necessarily successful in that, but I was getting phone calls from different people asking if I could help them with this, that, and the other thing. And they were all family businesses. And I started to realize, okay, maybe there's something here for me to do, working with families and family businesses. And that's what I've been doing since 2014. I'm not sure where it would have been if I'd really trying to pursue another human resources or corporate services role. But looking back, I'm tremendously happy that I took the path that I did. So keep your options open. Look for the opportunities that may not necessarily fit within the plan, because everything creates an opportunity for you to further develop your skill set and your expertise.
And Gerry, if we talk about opportunities, and assuming that the graduating class is young, up-and-coming individuals joining the workforce, plan for where you want to go, but allow for opportunities that present themselves. Within the family businesses that you've had the opportunity to work with, talking to the generations in those businesses, tell me a little bit more of how that attitude can help as you bringing that in as an advisor, but them contemplating that within their own structures.
Traditional relationships within family enterprises has been within the wealth management, the investment, the legal, the tax, the estate planning. My background is in human resources, which is, you can describe it a number of different ways, but really is all about relationships. And, from an HR perspective is acquiring the talent that will help the organization succeed. Transitioning into the family enterprise sector and the family enterprise advising sector, what I've been able to do is take the skills that I developed or acquired in staff development, et cetera, and transition that into working with both the active generation and the next generation around where does next generation want to fit in? How do they want to be part of this family enterprise, family organization going forward? Do they want to be active in the business? Do they not want to be active in the business? And with the active generation, what are their expectations? So really facilitating that conversation and developing those relationships, helping the multiple generations in a family enterprise have the conversations that need to take place in order to work on what is the succession, what is the continuity plan, how is the wealth going to transition from one generation to the next generation.
Gerry, going back, you pose the question of what are their expectations? And sometimes expectations are verbalized and sometimes they're not. Talking about opportunities versus expectations, can you touch a little bit more on, just some of the pressures and things that you see from that perspective?
The best way for me to answer that question is actually give you the story of the family that I worked with. And in that situation, we had a father who had a successful business, and he had two daughters that he decided to hand the business over to. When he initially had that conversation with the two daughters, he was completely surprised when the two daughters said, "We don't want the business. We don't want to run the business." Now, I was brought in after that had transpired, and I spent some time talking with the father. I spent some time talking with two daughters. I even spent some time talking with the mother. So the father had a preconceived notion that he would just hand over the business to the daughters. They would gladly accept it and then run the business, and et cetera. The daughters had a very different perspective. They wanted to manage the wealth or the asset, if you will, but they did not want to run the day-to-day operations because they felt their father's expectation would be that they would run the business he did, which was to work 70 hours a week, to work on the weekends, to work in the evenings and never take vacation. And that was not them. That was not their expectation. That was not what they wanted to do. So in the course of a number of discussions and interviews and then pulling the whole family together, I helped them get to a realization that there was an opportunity for the two daughters to continue to manage the asset, oversee the wealth, if you will, but not be involved in the day-to-day operations. And I was able to help the father understand that was actually okay, because he actually had done an incredibly good job of developing his executive team so that we could actually take someone out of his executive team to run the day-to-day operations, become the CEO of the business. And that freed up the daughters to be part of a board of directors that oversaw the strategic direction, et cetera, of the business and of the wealth. And it allowed for the father to take on a role as an interim role as an executive chair of that board, allowing for the transition and the exchange of expertise and understanding between the father and the daughters. So that is a scenario where you had two different generations, two different expectations or perceptions, and them not necessarily initially completely being in sync. And what it took was a series of conversations, discussions, questions to help both sides come to an understanding of each other's perspectives and desires and wishes, et cetera. And so we were successful in the sense that the business still stayed within the family. The daughters had a role that they were totally comfortable with, and the business had the necessary operational and executive leadership to continue. So what it really boils down to, Corey, is just in working with the different generations, is opening up the lines of communications between the generations. And to extend that aspect of the conversation a little bit further, there's a multitude of different models of family businesses and family enterprises. The most common that people Relate to is the three circle model that has the aspects of the family and of the business and of the ownership. And frequently, when I get involved with families, multi-generational families, and the business, those three elements are just in one big circle, and they're completely clouded together. And a lot of the work that I do with families is help them understand how to separate the conversations so that they understand what they need to talk about and how they can talk about these things and be governed in these conversations, and compartmentalize discussions on the family side, discussions around the ownership side, and discussions around the business operations, the management side. Because each of those conversations, while there are definitely elements of interrelationship, there are also elements of those conversations that are very different and need to be held differently. Because if you're talking about the shareholder side and what are decisions that rightly fall within the shareholder bucket, but you've got the family side and that's getting clouded in there. And I'm a family member, I'm your son, I have my spouse, I think she should be part of this conversation. Well, no, she shouldn't. Or maybe she should. But that needs to be a discussion and a decision that's made in advance.
Right.
So I spent a fair chunk of my time in the areas of governance and helping families parse out those conversations more succinctly fall into the right bucket.
Right. Gerry, going back to your story, and the mother and father developed their daughters, and the daughters spent their younger years up until that point at some point of education, be it going off somewhere, be it within the family, within the business. Everyone has their own journey, and some families a little bit more intentional than others in the way that they're developing that. Can you talk a little bit more of, as you said, they wanted to manage the business as a piece of wealth, that ended up the two daughters sitting on the board with a great executive team that dad had helped create. Some people have that vision and get to that point. Dad might not have, in this case, it sounded like with your guidance, it had helped and worked out. What if it didn't? What if he, let's say, let's start in the family and the daughters weren't prepared to be on the board, and maybe they just worked in the business and really didn't see that ownership side of things. How do you see that within some families?
Depend on what generational transition level they're at. If it's Gen 1 to Gen 2 or Gen 2 to Gen 3 or Gen 3 to Gen 4, Gen 1 to Gen 2, typically, stereotypically, the transition, the succession, the continuity is parent to child. And there may be a couple of children involved, in which case you're transitioning from kind of a sole operator to a sibling partnership. In that situation, maybe there's children that don't want to be part of the business. Maybe there's children that, bluntly put, shouldn't be part of the business. And what I do in those circumstances is work towards understanding the difference between operating the business and being a shareholder. And in some families, there's just an automatic assumption that if you're going to be a shareholder, you need to be in a business. In actual fact, that's not necessarily the case, and that's not necessarily what's best for the business. And developing the next gen as operators of the business versus developing the next gen as stewards of the wealth and effective shareholders, those are two different dynamics. Those are two different development plans, if you will. The skill sets are different. And so the usual process that I take is to sit down with the active generation and say, okay, so what are your expectations? What do you want to do? Where do you want to be in 5 years? And what are your expectations of your children? Do you expect them to come into the business? Do you expect them to become the next CEO? And if that's your expectation, have you talked to them about that? And have you looked to understand what their expectations are? And if you have that expectation, and if your child has that expectation, what are you doing? What needs to be done? What can and should be done to help them develop the necessary skill sets in order to be properly prepared? I've had a couple of circumstances, and I'm working with one client right now, where he had made the decision and his daughter had said yes, that he was now going to hand over or transition to his daughter taking on the CEO role. But she had no skill set. And he wanted to transition out within a year. And I'm
Wow.
going, don't think, don't think that's the timeline we're talking about here. So let's talk about what do you think is necessary for your daughter as minimum skill set competency requirements, and then let's map out what that looks like in terms of developing those. And then let's sit down with your daughter and get her perspective on this. And ultimately, where we ended up getting to is, he recognized that there's certain things that he was doing as CEO that he come to the realization went, nah, that's not really stuff that I should be doing as CEO. So we could rescale the role of CEO and then put in place a program to ramp his daughter up that was probably about a 2-year timeline, still fairly aggressive, but achievable.
Right.
So that's what's happening. But let's, to your point, let's talk about what happens if the child is not ready or has no interest, or in particularly difficult circumstances, the parent doesn't want the child to be involved in the business because they recognize they don't have what it takes to be a CEO. And how do you position that conversation? How do you set the stage for that to be a conversation that is ultimately successful,
Right.
and helping the child understand, okay, my future is not here. I'll go back to my earlier point, the distinction between the skill set to operate the business and the skill set to be an owner of the asset, the steward of the wealth. And in a couple of circumstances where I've been in those situations where the family don't necessarily perceive the next gen as being appropriate to run the business, we steer them into understanding, your future's not in the business, but your future is in managing the wealth.
Curious, as you mentioned, the aggressiveness of a development plan of 2 years. And, that 2 years goes by very quickly. But if you ask somebody, when do you want to have this happen by, 3 to 5 years tends to be a very common answer. And, you ask them next year, well, 3 to 5 years. And so, sometimes that time frame is shortened due to circumstances. There might be something outside of control that's creating that. But sometimes it's the opposite. I'd like to elevate this next gen within 3 to 5 years. And 3 years go by, 3 to 5 years. And it just kind of keeps going. And that next generation says, mom and dad or aunts and uncles, depending on where we are. All right, what's next? Where am I? They're in this development plan, they're bought in, but maybe again, expectations aren't communicated. So how do you see that, where maybe there's the implied you work in the business and now it becomes a little bit tough because, do they get fed up and leave? Do they approach the generation that's in control? How do you find those situations?
You'll notice that I'm chuckling as you're going through that particular example or a particular situation. And I've had to deal with that a couple of times. And you might remember earlier on, I said that I have a conversation with the active generation. And one of the things that I do ask them is, so, what's your plan? Where do you want to be in 5 years? And you might remember in the story that I told, I actually interviewed the father's wife. And in that particular scenario, I said, so where would you like to see the two of you in 5 years? What do you want to be doing in 5 years? Just as kind of a nominal time frame. What I'm doing with those questions in that dialogue is setting the stage to hold them accountable for the transition that is put in place, because they already indicated, in 5 years, I want to be in a motorhome and traveling the US or whatever the case may be. And you're dead right. The typical response in terms of timeline, 3 to 5 years. And I have been in a couple of situations where, the active generation is asked the question every year, and every year the answer is 3 to 5 years. So what needs to happen there is there needs to be an accountability. We're already holding the next gen accountable for their development and their experience, the experience they need to gain in order to position themselves to transition into the new role. Similarly, we need to hold the active generation accountable for letting go, stepping away. Sometimes that takes an outsider, not a family member. I've played that role in a couple of families. I've also seen it work very effectively if you have a board of directors and you have a couple of independents on that board. And those independents are made aware of the transition plan and can hold the active generation accountable to say, okay, the next gen has done what we asked them to do, and they're moving along quite nicely. What are you doing to prepare yourself to transition?
Right.
And, you said 3 to 5 years last year. You can't say 3 to 5 years this year. You can now say 2 to 4. Are you making the right progression? So there was a panel group at a conference a number of years ago that was talking about this and talking about the transition, and it had different generations from different businesses. And the exchange that stuck with me was the older generation in one business was talking about it. This gentleman was saying, it's really hard to let go. And what was interesting was the immediate response from another person on the panel, a different generation, a different business. So there was no relationship between these two people whatsoever. But their immediate response was, no, it's not.
Wow.
And that interplay for me illustrated, again, it goes back to opening up the lines of communication and managing the expectations, but also holding each other accountable within the family unit. If you're dad and you say you're transitioning out in 3 to 5 years, then you need to work towards that 3 to 5 years.
Absolutely.
And if you're the next gen and you're transitioning to take over in 3 to 5 years, then you need to be moving along that path to be fully prepared for the transition in 3 to 5 years.
Right. Oh, Gerry, you made mention of independent board members, and we've previously talked previous episodes about developing boards for advisory and how effective it can be. Now, but let's talk a little bit about non-family employees. And your background in HR, and a little bit of those relationships, because working in a family business as a non-family member is can have its challenges. And so going through the development and developing the active generation for their succession to their next chapter of life, but also watching the next generation develop. There's a bit of a hard place in between that and being those people in the business witnessing. Can you maybe tell a couple of stories as far as that goes?
Yeah, I'll share a few anecdotes. The family that I was a non-family executive in, the last several years that I was with them, the active generation had made the decision that they were transitioning from owner-operator to owner non-operator. 3 of the 7 shareholders were active in the business and had made the decision they were stepping out of the day-to-day operations. So that necessitated effectively hiring an entirely new non-family executive team up to and including CEO. In the course of going through that process, I observed some really interesting dynamics around how non-family executives worked effectively or not within the family business environment. And Corey quite bluntly put, as a non-family executive, you will never be equal. You will never be family. And you cannot lose sight of that. Conversely, and perhaps somewhat contradictory, again, I'll use the soundbite that I use periodically. I'm not doing my job either as a non-family executive or in my current role as a family enterprise advisor if I'm not one comment away from being fired. You need to be candid, you need to be transparent, and you need to show that you have the long-term interests of the family as a key driver of your behavior. But at the same time, you have to have the managerial courage, conviction, however you want to describe it, of being able to provide perspective that may be contradictory to what is in the best interests of the long-term aspects of the business. Because families and family enterprises and multi-generational families don't have a short-term perspective when it comes to their wealth. They have a long-term perspective. And I've worked in publicly traded companies many years ago where, if you're not generating a healthy percentage return on a quarterly basis, you're not doing your job. Family businesses sometimes don't think in those terms. They think about where do we want to be in 5, 7 years, not what do we need to do this quarter. And that can be a difficult transition for some non-family executives, is realizing that there is that long-term perspective that's involved. Similarly, the family needs to put in place a compensation and an incentive structure that ensures that the non-family executives are completely aligned with where the family's long-term strategic plan is going. So, there'll be a base comp element, there'll be an annual short-term incentive. But I see many families putting in place a long-term incentive plan that bridges three or so years that is tied to the preservation and risk managed growth of the overall value of the asset. So those are, a few elements around that non-family executive perspective that immediately come to mind.
Yeah. Well, and I love that you talked about that alignment and how different it is from a strategic plan that depends on the longevity of the business, not the quarterly return, and how that shows up as the market's expectations. Yep. And understanding that as a non-family executive, or even hiring those non-family executives, how does the approach change? Because you've got, sometimes that, as you said, the muddiness of ownership and those circles are muddying, but also the fact that the family maybe is being compensated as owners changes the way that they view compensation. But when you're non-family or non-ownership, it changes things, and sometimes the culture as far as compensation needs to be a little different.
So like the whole area of compensation within a family business, both for family and for non-family, could take an entire interview process in and of itself. As it relates to non-family executives coming into a family business and understanding how different that dynamic may be, as we were going through the interview process with this particular family where I was the VP of HR, and we got down to a lead candidate, I actually would have I'd have an interview with that person one-on-one, where I somewhat jokingly spent time convincing them not to take the role. The intent there was to make sure that they were fully aware of what it was that they were stepping into, and making sure that they understood the environment that they may have worked in before, which I would have a sense of, and how different that environment would be in this role that they were potentially going into. And I will say, I'm kind of blowing my own horn a little bit here, I will say that each of the non-family executives that we ultimately hired actually came to me afterwards to thank me for having that discussion with them, because they recognized that they would have not been fully prepared for the difference that they were facing as they came in without having that conversation. And the whole idea there was to help non-family executives understand, you're joining a family business, it's different. You may have family members reporting to you, it's different. As it relates to compensation for family members in the business and non-family members in the business, again, Corey, that's a whole separate conversation, and happy to do that as a secondary discussion at another point in time.
And I think that would be great, Gerry, because as I threw a lot into that question, I think that it was quite loaded. So
it was.
And there's so much there as it relates to compensation and development, and how you tie that in. So would love to do that and have another discussion with you at a future point. So
absolutely willing to continue that part of the conversation.
Awesome. Great. Now, Gerry, as we near the end of our conversation today, there's a few questions that I ask guests before we wrap up. Are you ready for the tough ones?
Sure.
All right. What is one key strategy that you believe is most essential for building a successful family enterprise?
it's thematically going back to what I said before, maintaining the lines of communication, recognizing that there are different dynamics at play in a family business between the family, the ownership, and the business. And quite frankly, this may sound self-serving to me and to those of us that are family enterprise advisors, engaging an outsider to help facilitate and manage those conversations. Because sometimes trying to do that internally, there's too much history, there's too much emotion, there's too much baggage. So engaging an independent third party to help facilitate those conversations is actually beneficial to the family.
Awesome.
And generally speaking, they get to a point where once they've had that facilitation a number of times, they need the facilitation less. In fact, with some clients, and there was one client for a period of time that I would work with for a little bit of time, and then things would end, and I would think, okay, we're done. And then I'd get a phone call saying, where are you? We need you back. And I have my own personal perspective. My job is to get them to the point they can have those conversations without a third party. If third party has to keep coming back in, then I don't think I've really done my job.
Right. Like raising a child.
Exactly.
How can you develop the skill set and let them fly? So that's great. And
Yeah.
I think making sure also that it's not considered a failure. I think the bringing every once in a while is maybe not a bad thing, but maybe less and less, and for different reasons, I think is great.
Yep.
Now, what would you say is the most common challenge that you see in family enterprises when it comes to wealth transition and generational continuity?
What I find quite regularly, not consistently, but quite regularly, is that sometimes the active generation has a perspective that says, this is how I got to where I am today, so my children need to follow the same path. The children are inheriting a wealth or a business in a very different environment, in a very different world than what their parents experienced. And so sometimes the path that the next gen need to take has to be different than the path that the active generation has taken. And I spend time helping both sides understand why that's not a bad thing, why that's actually a good thing, and why it's okay, why it's right for that process to unfold. There's one family that I've been working with for some time, and there's actually 3 generations active in the business. And the Gen 2 really weren't connecting with the Gen 4 because of that expectation that the Gen 4 had to go through the same process. So again, much dialogue, much discussion, much open communication. And they eventually both got to a point where they understood each other's perspectives and recognized that the pathway is different.
That's beautiful. I love that, bringing perspective and helping them see through the lens of the other. Now,
yeah,
Gerry, you might have answered this perfectly already, but any one strategy that might help overcome this beyond what you've shared?
The adage goes, once you've met one family business, you've met one family business.
Perfect. Good. That's great.
So the issues may be consistent across family businesses, but the approaches and resolutions tend to be unique to that particular family.
Yeah.
And part of my role as an advisor is to help them figure out what that looks like.
Now, in your experience, what are the top 3 qualities that successful family enterprise leaders possess?
Leaders?
Yeah.
Or family advisors?
No, the leaders in the enterprise. So be it, they're leading from the active generation, or they're developing those skills as the next generation.
That's a really good question, Corey. I'll put a few thoughts together. I'm not sure that they're complete, but what pops to mind first and foremost, the ability to recognize that what got us here as a family is not necessarily what we need going forward. The other element or leadership quality is recognizing that you don't need to be an expert in everything. And being comfortable surrounding yourself with people, resources, either within the family or within the business or outside, that have more experience than you do, have more expertise than you do, and being willing to listen to what is being provided to you.
Love it. That's great. I think the recognizing you don't need to be an expert, surrounding yourself by smarter people, and I think that's a great. And Jerry, before we conclude our discussion, I want to highlight where our listeners can engage in more conversations you're having, or where they can find you.
They can reach out to me through the contact information that I've provided. I have a website, meyeradvisorygroup.com. They can email me. I'm assuming you'll put that contact information up on the podcast.
Yep.
Happy to engage in the conversations as and if they want to reach out.
Fantastic. Now, Gerry, I wanted to make sure that we've covered everything today. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience that we didn't get a chance to touch on?
Oh, there's probably a multitude of things that we didn't touch on, but I think the core themes of what I hopefully was getting across, I think those are the baseline to pay attention to. I think the last closing comment I would make is, and how to package this, successful family businesses, family enterprises in a multi-generational environment and transitioning from one generation to the other, recognize that decisions need to be made based on policy, not based on emotion or situation or the individual. And the best example of that is families establishing a family employment policy. So what are the circumstances, or what are the requirements, et cetera, of how family members can come into the business? And I mention that only to emphasize that transition away from individual or situationally based decisions to a policy-based decision actually serves the family better, because then everyone can wrap themselves around the policy as opposed to a situational or individual-based decision, which creates the us and them outcome.
Love it.
Okay.
I appreciate that. That is a great piece of advice, Gerry, and I appreciate you sharing that.
Okay.
And all of the expertise that you've shared. Very much appreciate you taking the time with us today. And I found our conversation very valuable, and I hope that our listeners do as well. So thank you for your contribution.
You're quite welcome. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Myself, I always quite love having these kinds of conversations.
As we wrap up this episode, we invite you to contemplate the valuable insights Gerry has shared. Whether you're actively engaged in a family enterprise or providing advisory services, Gerry's expertise illuminates the intricacies of navigating generational transitions and fostering enduring legacies. Throughout our discussion, Gerry drew upon a wealth of experiences from his extensive career. Some key takeaways include recognizing the pivotal role of accountability in addressing succession challenges. We must hold the next generation accountable for their development and the essential experience to smoothly transition into new roles. Take a moment to consider what proactive steps are being taken to prepare for this transition. Similarly, accountability extends to the active generation, underscoring the significance of letting go and stepping away. Additionally, it's worth noting, in certain cases, an outsider rather than a family member may be better suited for certain roles. It's crucial to emphasize, as non-family executive, achieving equal status is unlikely. You won't be regarded as family, and it's essential to remain mindful of this reality. For further guidance and deeper exploration of key themes discussed, reach out to Gerry Meyer through Meyer Advisory Group. We've included all relevant information and links in our show notes for today. Thank you for joining me, Corey Gagnon, your host of Legacy Builders Podcast. It's my personal passion to explore with you these topics related to family wealth. If you enjoyed today's episode, you can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred podcast platform. And don't forget to share this episode with family, friends, and colleagues who you care about. If you'd like to help support this show, you can do so by leaving a rating and review. If you have any questions about anything shared on today's episode, or have topics you'd like us to dive deeper into in future episodes, please let us know by emailing beaconfamilyoffice@asante.com. That's beaconfamilyoffice@assante.com. Legacy Builders, Strategies for Building Successful Family Enterprises is brought to you by Beacon Family Office at Asante. Are you worried about losing what you've created and seeking ways to transition your wealth across generations? Beacon Family Office at Asante supports our clients transition their wealth while maintaining relationships. If you'd like to access more content we've created, you can visit us at beaconfamilyoffice.com or for more details on our services and book an initial call. Thanks again for listening, and until next episode, stay intentional about building your legacy. This program was prepared by Corey Gagnon, who is a senior wealth advisor with Beacon Family Office at Asante Financial Management Limited. This is not an official program of Asante Financial Management, and the statements and opinions expressed during this podcast are not necessarily those of Asante Financial Management. This show is intended for general information only and may not apply to all listeners or investors. Please obtain professional financial advice or contact us at beaconfamilyoffice@asante.com or visit beaconfamilyoffice.com to discuss your particular circumstances prior to acting on the information presented.